In the far reaches of 1850s Louisiana, where the trees grow thick with secrets and the air clings like a second skin, there was once a town few dared to find. Cypress Hollow wasn't marked on any map. It didn't need to be. Those who lived there knew the way by instinct through the fog, past the groaning pines, and over the mud paths that swallowed your boots whole. There were just enough people to call it a town. 27 homes, a church too crooked to be holy, and a post office that cut hair on Thursdays. The Hollow was hungry, always had been. The rain fell often, but never when you needed it. Roads disappeared beneath floodwater. Chickens died from sickness. Deer vanished from the woods. Most families survived on salt, superstition, and the mercy of meat when they could find it. But there was one place where meat never ran out, tucked behind a curtain of moss. Just beyond where the mist thickened into shadow stood a smokehouse that never stopped breathing. Its roof slouched like a drunkard. Its chimney choked out black fog morning and night. This was the Tibido place owned by two sisters, Ullei and Maybel. The town whispered about them with reverence, with fear, with something like hunger. They were kind, generous, elegant even, and no one ever saw them cry. Ullei the elder moved, like poetry in morning sharp eyes, quiet hands, always dressed in gloves. Maybel, soft-voiced and ribbon-haired, was harder to read. Her apron was always stained red long before any pig was ever slaughtered. They fed the town. When floods claimed livestock, the sisters brought stew. When the fever took hogs and hens alike, they delivered brisket wrapped in white linen, still warm. When winter stripped the forest bare, their smokehouse kept puffing, and meat still arrived, spiced and sliced just right. No one asked how. The explanation was always the same. A cousin in the northern hills, a trapper with barrels of salted meat. Some believed it, others guessed wild hogs hidden deep in the swamp. A few asked quiet questions and then stopped asking, because the food was too good and hunger too loud. The smokehouse sat behind their cottage, iron-hinged and locked with thick chains. It only opened on smoke days, when black clouds rolled. From its chimney and the scent of garlic, pepper and something metallic spread through the village like a hymn. It was impossible to ignore. Only Father Enri flinched when he smelled it. He was young, freshly ordained, a man who still ironed. His robes and believed truth was something you could hand to people like bread. He came to Cypress Hollow from Baton Rouge in the spring, hopeful and wide-eyed, ready to bring light to the dark corners of the parish. He didn't yet understand. Cypress Hollow didn't want the light. It preferred the fog. I found the town polite, but too quiet. People smiled, nodded, thanked him for his sermons and then turned their backs. They never asked about the missing. They never noticed the strangers who entered the Tibido home and never came back out. A fur trader, a mute boy, a pregnant woman trying to reach her sister's farm. Each one marked as arrived in the church ledger, none marked as departed. But the sisters kept feeding everyone. That seemed to be enough. Ullei would walk through town in her pressed skirts, handing out neat bundles tied with twine, always polite, always smiling. Maybel rarely left the property, staying close to the smokehouse, humming under her breath, her hands always busy with something that smelled like sorrow. No livestock ever wandered their yard. No pigs, no chickens, not even feathers in the wind. And yet, the food came. Ribs, loins, sausages, stew so rich it made grown men cry into their bowls. And the town ate, eagerly, thankfully, gratefully. One man, a wheelwright with bad knees and a better memory, muttered to Enri one day, "They come through, the travelers, but they don't leave." Enri asked, "What do you mean?" The man just spat into the mud and whispered, "Ask the smokehouse. It always eats." Enri wanted to dismiss it as swamp talk, but doubt had already begun to fester. Priest noticed things, small things, quiet things. The way the smokehouse door never opened for deliveries. The way Maybel's apron stayed bloodied even on Sunday. The way the town avoided certain questions, like a wound they'd learned to dress without looking. And then came the boy, Jack LaRue, 10 years old, too curious for his own good, vanished one gray morning after babbling about something he'd seen behind the Tibido house. His father thought he was drunk. The town said he'd run away. Only Enri believed the boy was telling the truth. The chimney coughed thicker that night, blacker than ever, and still the town ate. Still no one asked. The Tibido sisters smiled at the harvest festival, ladling out stew dark as shadow and fragrant as memory. The people laughed and hummed and licked their spoons. Enri watched from the church steps, hands trembling, unable to speak, because he understood something terrible. This wasn't a miracle, it was a transaction. The sisters fed the town. In return, the town stayed silent, and silence, Enri realized, was the most monstrous appetite of all. By midsummer of 1854, Cypress Hollow had become an island of plenty in a sea of famine. The drought had crawled across Louisiana like a curse. Neighboring towns prayed over empty pans, their wells dry, their barns hollow. Animals vanished, crops wilted under a breathless sky, but not Cypress Hollow. No, in that hungry season, the tables here still bent under the weight of meat, brisket, smoked ribs, tenderloin stew, sausages thick with spice, roasts wrapped in rosemary. Every Sunday, the townspeople gathered behind the church beneath patchwork awnings, their mouths already watering before the food arrived. And it always arrived from the same place, the Tibido sisters, Ullei and Maybel, untouched by plague or scarcity, still glowed like figures from a stained glass window, their cheeks pink, their smiles unwavering, their hands generous with ladles and kindness. People called them saints, angels. Father Enri was not so sure. He had spent the past few weeks watching, not preaching, watching, and what he saw turned his prayers sour in his throat. He saw how no livestock ever came or went from their land. He saw how men, drifters, traders, strangers entered their cottage with heavy boots and left nothing behind but questions. He saw how the villagers averted their eyes. He saw too much hand, not nearly enough. 6 names. That's how many were marked in his registry as arrived. None were marked as departed. A merchant from Opelousas, a fur trapper, a mute boy, a pregnant woman. All had stopped at the Tibido house. None had been seen again. Enri had spoken to the farmers. Not one had sold the sisters so much as an egg. The market vendors couldn't recall a single pound of meat purchased by them, and yet, the smokehouse breathed every day. The thick, dark plume curled into the sky, carrying that strange, sweet scent roasted ham dipped in iron. Stomach turn and his heart ache. One Sunday, Enri stood by the church's wide oak doors, watching as Maybel crossed the square in her blood-spotted apron, in her arms a basket of smoked ribs. She placed it gently on the table, smiled, and walked away. The crowd erupted, clapping, laughing, fingers licked clean. No one asked, no one wondered. They just ate. That night, Enri sat alone on the church steps, the candlelight trembling against his collar. He couldn't shake the feeling. This wasn't generosity, it was a bargain, and the price had already been paid. Later that week, a man named Elijah Cole arrived in town, a trader with hard eyes and weathered hands, the kind of man who'd seen too much to scare easily. Enri approached him quietly. "Don't stay with the Tibido sisters," he warned. "Don't eat their food." Elijah smirked. "Preacher, I've walked through darker hollows than this. 2 sweet women feeding the poor. I'll take my chances." That evening he was seen stepping into the Tibido home, his boots muddy, his cart still full. By morning, the cart was untouched, the horse tied where it had been left, but Elijah Cole was gone. The townsfolk shrugged. Probably left early, took the east road. Men like him don't linger, but Enri had walked the east road at dawn. No tracks, no signs, just fog and silence. That night, the smokehouse chimney belched a plume darker than sin. Enri didn't sleep. He opened the rectory windows and nearly gagged. The air was thick with that cloying, coppery sweetness, a smell too human to mistake. He crossed himself, whispering desperate prayers for Elijah Cole's soul. The next day, Ullei came to the church. She wore pale gloves and a smile soft as velvet. In her hands, a tray of honey-glazed meat wrapped in parchment. "For the congregation," she said. Enri stared at her, searching for cracks. But she stood there poised, her silver hairpins gleaming like little blades. He took the tray. He did not serve it. That night, with trembling hands, he buried the offering in the garden behind the church. The soil swallowed it like it had done so many other secrets. Something was terribly wrong in Cypress Hollow, and the town, Enri realized, didn't want it fixed. The food was too good. The sisters were too generous. And hunger had become too familiar. They would not listen to sermons. They would not follow doubt. They had made peace with forgetting. But forgetting doesn't erase what's done. It only seasons it, makes it go down easier. And in Cypress Hollow, silence was the richest spice of all. The children of Cypress Hollow had always been warned to stay away from the woods, not because of wolves or ghosts, but because the trees listened and they remembered. Jack LaRue didn't care. He was 10 years old, all elbows and sharp questions, with eyes too big for his head and a hunger for stories that adults never dared to tell. His father, a trapper with tired hands and a sour bottle always nearby, tried to keep him close. But children born in places like Cypress Hollow know how to slip between cracks. They learn to move like shadows, especially when grown-ups are too distracted by the lies they've told themselves. And Jack had a question no one wanted to answer. Where did the meat come from? He'd never seen the Tibido sisters raise a single animal, no pigs in their pen, no chickens in their yard, not even bones left behind in the creek mud. And yet, every week, without fail, they delivered slabs of smoked perfection that made grown men hum with gratitude. So Jack waited. One Sunday, while the town napped and the swamp yawned beneath a heavy fog, he slipped between two cypress trees and crept toward the back of the Tibido cottage. He kept low, quiet. The air smelled like wet leaves and smoke. And then he saw it. The smokehouse. It squatted at the edge of the property like something wounded and rotting, wood blackened from years of heat and secrets. Its door was chained, but the boards had warped with time. Jack found a thin seam, just enough to press one eye against when the wind shifted the smoke. What he saw would never leave him. It was not a pig, not any animal he knew. It was a man bare-chested, hanging upside down from a hook, his back split open in neat lines. Steam rose from his skin, and below him, a bucket caught the slow drip of something thick and dark. The room was silent, except for the soft hiss of fat meeting coals. Jack stumbled backward, choking on a scream he didn't remember swallowing. He ran, stumbling over roots and stones, all the way home, where he threw himself into his father's arms, breathless, babbling nonsense, bodies, blood. The smokehouse. His father, still half drunk, cuffed him hard across the ear. You've been spying on them ladies. That'll get you whipped. Boy, ain't nobody likes a liar. But Jack kept insisting. Over and over he told the story, voice cracking with fear. The figure, the hook, the bucket, the man. By morning he was gone, his bed empty, shoes by the door, the front latch still locked, no footprints in the mud, no creak on the stairs, just silence. The town whispered. Some said he'd run away, frightened by his father. Others claimed he got lost in the swamp. A few muttered about the old stories, the ones no one ever finished telling. Only Father Enri believed otherwise. He returned to his registry that morning with a new name to write, a new loss, a new emptiness. He visited Jack's father, who sat, red-eyed, clutching a bottle he couldn't finish. Enri asked the question no one else dared. Did he say where he saw the body? The man hesitated, then nodded, said it was behind the smokehouse. I told him he was seeing things, but now... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. That night, the smokehouse chimney exhaled thick and smug. Father Enri walked barefoot through the chapel, his prayers cracked and raw. Outside, the fog pressed against the stained glass windows like a ghost waiting for permission. To enter, he knew what had to be done, and soon. The next morning, he watched as the Tibido sisters handed out their usual parcels. Ullei wore pale green gloves and a ribbon in her hair. Maybel hummed a lullaby soft as syrup. They smiled. They waved. They thanked the town for its kindness. Enri approached them with slow, deliberate steps. May I speak with you? He asked. Ullei turned, gentle as always. Of course, father. It's about the boy, Jack. He's gone. He said he saw something behind your home. For the first time, something shifted in Ullei's face. Not fear, not surprise, just calculation. He was a troubled child, she said gently. We've always tried to be kind to the little ones, but some just lose their way. Did he come to your property? No more than any other child, she replied smoothly. You know how they are, always imagining monsters. Enri looked at Maybel. She stared at the ground. Silent. Always silent. He left with a nod, but the storm had already begun. 2 days later, a satchel was found caught in the reeds behind the smokehouse. It was half buried in mud. Inside, a slingshot, a wooden soldier, and a strip of blood-stained cloth. The sheriff dismissed it. Could belong to anyone. Boys leave things behind. But Enri said nothing. He simply returned to the church, lit a single candle, and whispered a prayer not for the lost, but for those who had chosen not to look still. The smokehouse breathed. Still. The town ate still. No one asked why the sisters never wept when children vanished, because once you taste something too rich to forget, you'll do anything to keep your appetite from remembering what it cost. No one saw Father Enri the morning he decided to break into the Tibido home. That it was early, still dark enough for the stars to whisper. The swamp air hung like wet cloth, clinging to his collar, weighing down his breath. Cypress Hollow moved slow. That day, dulled by heat and secrets, the sisters had gone to market, baskets swinging, laughter echoing faintly down the lane. Enri had been watching, counting their steps, waiting. He crossed the churchyard with purpose, past the old oak with the hollowed trunk, and disappeared into the trees behind the Tibido cottage. The house stood pristine beneath a mossy canopy, whitewashed, delicate, draped in lace like a memory too sweet to question. He didn't knock. He used the edge of his crucifix to wedge open the back door. It groaned like something wounded inside. The house smelled of lavender and smoked meat. Sunlight filtered through. Lace curtains, casting soft ghosts onto the walls. The parlor was untouched. Doilies straight, piano clean, a grandfather clock ticking just 3 minutes slow. A painting of 2 young girls in white stood over the mantel, smiling beside a river that had likely never existed. He searched the kitchen first, then the pantry, then the hall that led to the bedrooms. Nothing, no bones, no trapdoors, no hidden rooms. Last. Her bed was made perfectly. Her hairbrush sat beside a ribbon on the dresser. A small rocking chair rested in the corner, beside a shelf of antique dolls, their glass eyes dull in the morning light. Then he saw it, a floorboard, just beneath the rocking chair, slightly raised, like a breath held too long. Enri dropped to his knees, heart pounding. He slipped the tip of his crucifix into the gap and pried it loose. The wood gave way with a quiet sigh, revealing a cavity in the floor. Inside, a leather-bound journal, worn, damp, sweating. He lifted it with shaking hands and opened to the first page. This is not for God to read. This is not for guilt. This is only for remembering. He turned the page. Then another. And another. Each one bore a name, a date, and a note. Amos Talbot, April 1847, bitter, too old, kept screaming. Hilda Ross, July 1849. Fat content, ideal. Slight illness before, but didn't matter. Josiah Pine, May 1850. Strong flavor, took longer to soften. Worth it. Baby G, January 1851. Would not stop crying. Waste of brine. The ink was neat, elegant. The hand delays, without a doubt, flowed like poetry. There were dozens of names. Some he knew, some he'd buried. Others had been whispered about and dismissed. And then the last page. Its ink still damp. Jacques Leroux, September 1854. Curious, to lean but sweet and quiet. Didn't struggle much. Enri slammed the journal shut. He couldn't breathe. The house seemed to exhale around him, the floorboards creaking with unseen weight. He wanted to scream, to cry, to vomit maybe all at once. But instead, he tucked the journal under his coat, replaced the floorboard, and walked out with the stillness of a man who had just seen God turn his face away. Back in the rectory, he locked the doors, lit every candle he owned, sat before the altar and did not pray. He simply stared at the journal. What horrified him most wasn't just the killing, it was the care, the craftsmanship, as if the sisters were artists perfecting a recipe, as if the flesh had become a sacrament. The next morning Enri visited the home of Reverend Enri, the former priest of Cypress Hollow, long since retired. The old man greeted him in a dusty robe. Blinking against the sun, Enri handed him the journal. Arnor read for a long time. He stopped at one entry. His hands trembled. Tobias Arne, November 1838. That was my nephew, he whispered. We thought he drowned. Enri's voice was stone. He didn't. There was nothing else to say. Word spread quietly like a sickness people didn't want to admit. Whispers in the market. Nervous glances near the well. Women clutched their children tighter. Men eyed the smokehouse chimney with unease. But still, no one confronted the sisters that evening. Ullei and Maybel returned home and noticed something small. A single floorboard nailed slightly askew. They said nothing, but the next morning Father Enri found a parcel at the church door, wrapped in parchment, tied with a red ribbon, inside smoked meat, and resting on top, a button-bone white round, chipped at the edge, identical to the one Jack had worn on his shirt. Enri didn't touch it. He didn't open the paper. He burned the entire thing in the church garden, the smoke curling upward, bitter and slow. That night, the smokehouse chimney glowed a deeper red than usual. Then, for the first time, the town looked up. Harvest came late that year. Cypress Hollow waited and waited, but the crops were thin, the fish listless, the woods empty. Even the birds sang quieter, as if afraid of drawing attention. The air clung to skin, bloated and rancid with a scent. No one dared name like spoiled rain and something older rotting beneath it. And still, the Tibido sisters prepared a feast. They always did, each year. Before the flood rains returned, the town gathered behind the chapel for the Harvest Sunday celebration. They strung lanterns between trees, laid patchwork quilts over old tables, and played the same 2 fiddle songs on repeat. Families brought what little they had: dried molasses, rock biscuits, a pot of half-mashed potatoes. But the meal that mattered, what they waited for, came from Ullei and Maybel. This year, it was stew, thick and black as creek water, meat falling off the bone, swimming in sweet onions and gold potatoes. Maybel ladled it out slowly, Her pale lips curled faintly as each bowl was filled. Her lullaby soft and syrupy drifted over the tables like a thread of smoke. Father Enri did not eat, stood beneath the old oak tree, hands clasped, watching how they devoured it, how they smiled through greasy mouths, how they closed their eyes and sighed, as if warmth itself had taken root inside their ribs. Not a soul asked where it came from, but Enri did not need to wonder. He knew it. Thought of the journal, now wrapped in cloth and buried beneath a wine crate in the rectory cellar. He thought of Jack's satchel, half buried in reeds behind the smokehouse. He thought of the button wrapped with smoked meat. The truth had already risen. But truth means nothing unless someone is willing to taste it. And then it happened. A woman screamed, not a shriek of fear, something smaller, sharper, confused. She had bitten into something hard. She spit it into her palm. A button. Bone-white dot, chipped dot, exactly like the one Enri had burned. Gasps whispered down the tables like falling dominoes. A beggar old Silas had worn a coat with buttons just like that. He'd come into town weeks ago. Camped by the chapel steps. Gone now, vanished. Like the rest. Enri stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "This is not beef," he said. The music faltered. Bowstrings stuttered. Bowstrings hovered in midair. "This stew," he continued, "is not from any cow or pig. Dare, it's from someone who walked among us, someone we let disappear." All eyes turned toward the smokehouse, but not all eyes stayed there. Ullei and Maybel stood beside their cauldron, unflinching. Ullei set her ladle down, brushing invisible dust from her apron. "Father," she said sweetly, "perhaps the heat's gotten to you. You haven't eaten all day. Sit, have a bowl. You'll feel better." "I've seen your ledger," he replied. "I've read the names." A ripple passed through the crowd, confusion, disbelief. Mothers gripped children closer, men exchanged wary glances, but no one stood beside him. "You'll accuse these women," said Mayor Ruland, rising. His voice was calm, cold. "They fed us through famine, through flood. You'll accuse them on the basis of a button." Enri scanned the faces. Not just a button, a dozen names, a missing boy, and meat that tastes nothing like anything God ever made. Another man stood. "You refused to bless the meal. You've been off ever since Jack disappeared. Maybe it's you who's unwell." Ullei wiped her hands delicately. "We've never turned away a mouth. Even when others had nothing to give, we gave. And now this." Her voice cracked. Whether real or rehearsed, no one could tell. Maybel bowed her head, wrung her hands like a girl caught lying. The villagers murmured, but their eyes, they weren't on the sisters anymore. They were on Enri. They trusted the ones who fed them, the ones who brought laughter and stew, not the one who brought sermons and suspicion. And Enri understood, in that moment, why silence had endured so long. Because to believe him meant admitting what was already in their bellies. It meant acknowledging that the comfort they praised had a price. It meant they had eaten it. And once you recognize the taste of sign, you either cleanse yourself in truth or drown in denial. Enri turned and walked away. Behind him, the music resumed lower, quieter. The feast went on with less laughter, less chewing, but it went on. That night, in the chapel, Enri lit 11 candles. He whispered 11 names, some from the journal, some from memory, some that no one else remembered at all. Outside, the smokehouse chimney glowed red against the stars, and far out in the woods, just beyond the last cypress tree, a woman's voice began to hum, a lullaby. Soft, sweet, like syrup stirred into blood. There comes a moment when faith cracks not with thunder, but with quiet certainty. By the third night after the feast, Father Enri knew what the town refused to admit. Cypress Hollow had made its choice. They would not accuse, they would not confront, they would continue to eat and forget. The truth was too heavy, too human, too late. If justice was to come, it would not arrive with prayers or sermons, it would arrive with fire. Enri began watching the sisters more closely, not with the eyes of a priest, but of a hunter. He noted their rhythms, when they left for the market, when the back shed sat unlocked, when the smokehouse doors groaned open to feed another lie. The shed, he realized, was key, not the cottage, not the parlor trimmed in lace, not the piano with one missing key. The back shed leaning sideways, its wood swollen with secrets. That's where it happened. That's where the truth was carved, drained, and wrapped in linen. Enri made his decision. On a Sunday evening, as the sky burned orange behind the moss-draped trees, he shed his cassock, smeared dirt across his collar, dust on his boots, and he walked into the forest like a man who no longer expected to return. At dusk, he stepped onto the Tibido trail. Head down, shoulders slumped. A stranger. When Maybel opened the front door, he kept his eyes lowered. "Evening," he murmured, voice hoarse. "Lost the road by the river bend. wondered if a man might find a place to rest. She blinked once, then smiled. Of course, poor thing, she said gently. We never turn away a hungry soul. Inside the cottage was warm, too warm. The fire crackled low, casting soft gold across the floor. Tea steamed from a chipped porcelain cup, sweet-smelling, cloudy. Too sweet. Enri recognized it immediately. Laudanum, valerian root, Belladonna-maybe. He stirred the tea, lifted it to his lips, and let it slip from his hand. His head dropped onto the armrest, limp as a body prepared for burial. Eyes half shut, breath slowed, but he was not asleep. Through a sliver of vision, he watched Ullei and Maybel as dusk. She carried an apron folded neatly over one arm. From beneath it, the glint of a blade. He'll keep, she said, almost tenderly thin. Maybel whispered, but preachers' tongues are always sweet. They moved toward him like dancers, slow, deliberate, not cruel, practiced. Ullei leaned in close. Her breath smelled of clothes and iron. It's better when they don't fight, she murmured. The meat tells fewer stories. That was the moment Enri's eyes snapped open. He rose with a cry and shoved both sisters back. Maybel hit the wall hard, crumpling with a gasp. Ullei staggered, dropping the knife. Enri bolted through the kitchen, threw open the back door, and sprinted toward the shed. He didn't hesitate, he kicked it open. Inside, the stench hit like a fist butt. It wasn't rot, it was clean. Too clean. The scent of bleach, brine, copper, and smoke. A surgeon's theater disguised as a butcher's stall. Hooks lined the walls, some rusted, some wet. Buckets, chains, wooden tables scarred deep. A drain carved into the floor. In the corner, a chest swollen, buzzing with flies. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He struck a match, dropped it. The flames caught fast, licking the floorboards like they were thirsty, oil-soaked, prepared that it burned. The shed ignited like dry bone, the smoke rising high and black into the night sky. Behind him, he heard screams, not of the sisters, of the voices buried in that wood, the bones beneath the floor, of the ones who never left. Then came the wail, Ullei's voice, raw and shrill. You stole our flock. You stole our blood. Enri staggered backward as the roof collapsed. Embers rained across the clearing. Smoke curled into the trees like fingers reaching for a last grip. The townsfolk came running. Buckets, pitchforks, bare hands. They stood in silence, watching the fire consume what fed them for years. No one spoke. No one tried to stop it. In the light of the flames, secrets became silhouettes. Smokehouse shadows danced across their faces. Fathers, mothers, widows, all who had tasted. They saw what they had ignored, and it was burning. In the morning, nothing remained but scorched timber and ash. The sheriff called it lightning, wrote it down, closed the case. No investigation, no arrests. Trying quiet truth. Beneath their silence, they had all eaten, and some things once tasted cannot be undone. It meant they had eaten it. By dawn, the Tibido smokehouse was nothing but a charred skeleton. The shed, once the town's unspoken temple of comfort, lay broken, its beams blackened like old teeth. Its chimney, still coughing faint trails of smoke into the morning sky, looked almost confused, as if it, too, had never expected an end. And yet, the end had not come, because the ground beneath, the smokehouse was still breathing. It began with the soil cracked and steaming from the heat. Then a gasp. A woman fell to her knees beside the scorched wood. Something pale poked through the ash. A child's ribcage, small, fragile, burnt but unmistakably whole. A silence fell over the crowd, like a dropped veil. Then someone else saw it. To the left, a femur, long and splintered, a skull with its jaw frozen wide, and beside it, a ring. Gold, dented, its engraving still legible. Martha Louvier stepped forward. Her hand trembling, she picked up the ring, looked at it, her breath caught. This was my brother's, she whispered. Jacob, our father, gave it to him when he turned 17. He went missing 13 years ago. They said he drowned. Her voice cracked. He hated the water. A man removed his hat. We always said Billy was touched in the head, he muttered. But I remember, he knocked on their door once, said he was looking for work. Never saw him again. A woman, white in the face, spoke through her apron. My aunt, she came visiting from Baton Rouge, stayed with them 2 nights, said the stew was divine, then she left. Or that's what we told ourselves. Another voice. I found a shoe in the creek once, still tied, too small for a man. One by one they remembered, that not new truths but old doubts, things they'd buried under spice and salt and hunger. Now, the fire had unearthed them. Father Enri stood a little apart from them, leaning against the chapel wall. He did not speak, he did not weep. He had no sermon to give. This was not salvation. This was grief. And it belonged to all of them. The sheriff arrived late. Face pale, voice hoarse. We'll sort this, he mumbled. We'll count, identify, bury. But there were too many bones, too many names, gone unwritten. The gravedigger tried to count quietly, carefully. He stopped at 30. Then someone found it near the center of the ruin, tucked in the soil like a treasure half-burned, untouched by flame. A wooden box. Simple, no lock, no hinges. Just a carved lid with delicate handwriting scorched into its top. We remember them in flavor, not in name. Inside, tokens, brooches, shoe buckles, baby ribbons, eyeglasses, bits of lace. Things no one would miss except the people who had loved them. Father Enri stepped forward, knelt by the box, and whispered, Lord, forgive what no man can forget. The sun sank low. The air thickened again. But this time, no one spoke of blessings. Children were pulled indoors early. Doors were double-locked. The stew went untouched. Even the dogs would not walk near the smokehouse ruins. Where once Cypress Hollow had feasted. Now it whispered. She always hummed, didn't she? While she stirred. That tea always made me tired. How did we never ask? Truth had crawled through fire and ash to meet them face to face, and what stared back was hunger starved for conscience. That night, Father Enri lit 11 candles at the altar. One for each name he knew, one for each soul the town had fed upon. He whispered each name into the dark, not to God, but to the silence, and the silence whispered back with memory, not a ghost, but heavier than one. Outside, the wind shifted, and through the trees, faint as breath, someone began to hum, a woman's voice, soft, steady, stirring the air like a spoon in blood. Some stories burn with the fire, but not this one. The flames that devoured the Tibido smokehouse in the summer of 1854 took with them flesh, wood, and secrets, but not the shame, not the memory. Cypress Hollow learned what it had been fed. It could never unlearn it. In the weeks that followed, the town changed, not loudly but deeply, in ways only the hungry understand. The laughter that once echoed from porches during supper dried up like riverbed mud. The clatter of spoons grew hesitant, hollow. Even the dogs grew quiet near the ruins. And though the townsfolk tried God, they tried to go back to rabbit, duck, venison. Nothing tasted the same. Because now, they wondered about every bite, about every mouthful they once swallowed too quickly, too gratefully, because it had been delicious. And that was the worst part. Father Enri stayed just long enough to bury 11 simple wooden crosses in a quiet field. No blessings, just silence. No songs were sung. He kept no new journal. He gave no sermons. When asked why he was leaving, he gave no reason. He simply walked out of the town, out of their story, out of the stain he could not cleanse. He carried only his Bible and the weight, the kind that can't be named, the kind that settles in your lungs like smoke and never lets go. But Enri soon discovered that some stories follow you no matter how far you walk. Wherever he went, Havana, Baton Rouge, Maybel, people found him, not by name, but by the feeling that crept into the room with him. The smell of wood smoke, of roasted sweetness gone to rich. In every town, it was the same. He would rent a room, a corner upstairs, something small, something away from the kitchens. He would stay a few nights, and someone would dream. It began with scent. Meat, smoked, familiar. Then came the rest. A cellar door that wouldn't stay shut, small teeth in a palm, a woman's humming near the fire. Sometimes the boarding house keeper would knock on his door in the dead of night. You were screaming, they'd say, begging, whispering names we didn't know. He never explained. He would only thank them quietly, and leave by morning soon. Towns began to whisper. There's a priest who walks alone. They say he's cursed. He doesn't age much. Don't eat. If he blesses your table. The food tastes too familiar. Back in Cypress Hollow, the story curdled. The vines reclaimed the road. The chapel closed. The sheriff moved away. The market dried up like the creek in July. The last child born in town cried for a week and never opened his eyes. Eventually, mapmakers stopped naming it altogether, but those who had lived there remembered. They carried that memory like a second tongue. It twitched whenever meat hit a pan. It recoiled at smoke too thick to be natural. Years later, some confessed. They came to Enri in towns far away, in shadows, after services, after wine. I liked it, one man whispered, weeping. I didn't know, but I liked it. Another, older, gentler, murmured, sometimes I still dream of her. Ullei, she's smiling, holding a plate. And the worst of all, sometimes I miss the taste. Enri would listen. He would say nothing. There was nothing left to say. In his final years, he returned only once to Cypress Hollow. The road was gone. just weeds now, chest high and humming with flies. The 11 crosses were still there, faded, crooked, weathered. He lit a candle, set it in the dirt, spoke 4 words, "May you be forgotten," and turned to leave. But the wind moved then, and lo, brushing past his shoulder, and in it, faint as a breath held too long, he heard it. Not a voice, not a ghost, a woman's lullaby stirring something, the sound of a spoon moving through stew. They say if you stand where the Tibido smokehouse once stood, just where the ash has settled into the bones of the earth and the mist is low, and the moon hangs pale and hollow, you'll hear it, that humming, not a melody, not a song, but a memory, a woman's voice, low and syrup slow, as if stirring something thick. The story of Cypress Hollow was never written down. Not in ledgers, not in Sunday letters, not in school books. No grave markers, no town plaque, no elegy. It lives only in rumor, in breath, past, from mouth to trembling mouth, in the twitch of the tongue when a stew is too rich. And in the woods, the sisters still walk. That's what they say, not seen but sensed. 2 figures, one tall, one stooped, one in green gloves, the other with a ribbon in her hair, moving through the cypress-like wind with a purpose. Their baskets hang from their arms like memories, and wherever they pass, the butcher stalls lose meat, quietly, cleanly, bones left behind, as if only the best cuts were taken, and always someone has bought smokewood, not the kind you use for ribs, the kind that smells too sweet when it burns. You can laugh, you can call it backwards nonsense, but then explain why, in nearby towns, people still disappear, why peddlers vanish on the same bend in the road, why no one builds a home near Cypress Hollow's ruins. Not even hunters, not even fools. The fire may have devoured the sister's house, but the hunger stayed. It settled into the town like a second skin. You can feel it in the dirt, in the soft unease of early morning silence, in the way people hesitate before tasting unfamiliar meat, in the way certain smells cause grown men to lose their appetite entirely. Some deny it, some don't, but all of them remember, though they never speak it plainly. She always hummed, they say, slicing potatoes too slowly. She always smiled when she handed me that plate. Funny how we never saw pigs, or goats, or anything. A few admit they still wake with the taste on their tongue. They dream of stew. Not just any stew, the Tibido stew. Complex, something that lingered long after the bowl was emptied. No other dish satisfies, because no other dish lies so perfectly. And Father Enri, he's gone now, buried in a parish far away, beneath a cross with no name. The priest who walked for years with no flock, no sermon, only a journal once wrapped in cloths and sealed with silence. But there's a story the grave couldn't take from him, that once, in a town no longer on any map, the people were fed. Fed so well, they forgot to ask why the bones never came back. Fed so fully, they learned to love the taste of silence more than the truth. And sometimes when the fog rolls thick, and your spoon lifts something unfamiliar from your platial pores, you'll hesitate, and if you listen closely, past your own heartbeat, past the crackling fire, you'll hear it, a woman humming, and behind her, the sound of knives being sharpened. In the end, it wasn't the fire that haunted Cypress Hollow. It was the taste. The fire cleansed the smokehouse, the flames took the shed, the hooks, the tools, the blood-soaked floorboards. They swallowed the screams, they chewed through the bones. But fire cannot touch memory. And hunger always survives. After Father Enri left, Cypress Hollow rotted from within, slowly, quietly, like a wound under lace. The chapel doors stayed shut, the gardens wilted, the market dried up. No one bought, no one sold, and even the air changed thick. Now, with a permanent trace of rot, as if the land itself refused to forget, the townspeople stopped gathering. They whispered instead. They whispered about the stew, about the ribs, about how soft the dumplings were that winter, about the sweetness in the sausage, but mostly, they whispered about themselves, because no matter how many times they denied it, or how tightly they shut their mouths, they had eaten it, they had swallowed it down gracefully, gratefully, and wiped their lips. They had called it mercy, they had called it salvation, but it was flesh, it was human, and worse still, they had known, not in words, not in facts, but in that ancient animal part of the gut that tightens when something isn't right. They had known, and they had chosen to forget. That's what made the sisters monsters, not because they killed, but because they gave the town what it wanted. They fed them well enough that truth became unnecessary. You don't need to ask questions when your mouth is full. So when the Tibido smokehouse burned, no one celebrated. There were no cheers, no closure, only a silence that tasted like ash. The sheriff filed no charges. wrote no names, packed his things and left the town that had once worshipped its own silence. The gravedigger buried what bones he could identify, but he never stopped seeing the ones he couldn't. Eventually, Cypress Hollow became something else, a place you don't talk about, a name that disappears from signs, from maps, from stories parents tell their children, except in one way: when meat tastes too sweet, when smoke hangs too thick, when a child asks, "Where does it come from?" and no one wants to answer, that's when the whispers begin. Again, about the sisters, about the priest, about the button in the stew. Some say the sisters are still out there, not alive, not really, but walking through fog, through forests, through the backs of towns that smell too much like smoke. Some say they don't want revenge, they just want to feed, and who can blame them? They were only ever a mirror, and Cypress Hollow. Cypress Hollow wasn't a tragedy because of what the Tibido sisters did, that it was a tragedy because of what everyone else allowed. The priest who waited too long, the mother who looked the other way, the mayor who chose comfort over truth, the town that decided silence was easier than hunger. So now, when people sit down to eat, and their spoon hovers just above the bowl, sometimes they feel it, that quiet pause, that ancient ache, that flicker of memory. Not fear, not guilt, but hunger. And if the smoke curls just right, if the stew is rich enough, they forget all over again. Because the truth is, we all want to believe we're innocent, but the truth tastes better when it's cooked low and slow and served with a smile. The fire had died, but Cypress Hollow had not. It should have ended there, in the flames. That's what Father Enri thought. That once the smokehouse fell, once the bones were unearthed, once the stew stopped being served, the curse would lift. That maybe, just maybe, the town would be clean again. But Cypress Hollow didn't burn, it festered. 3 days after the fire, the fog returned, not the usual swamp mist. This was thicker, hungrier. It clung to porches and crawled down chimneys. It wrapped itself around the chapel's broken bell and refused to lift. Even by midday, the townspeople took to staying indoors, windows shuttered, eyes wide open in the dark. They said the air smelled of old smoke and wet stone. They were wrong, it smelled like memory. The sheriff left without a word, took the east road with nothing but a sack and the regret pressed into his spine. His house remained locked, empty, inside, on the table. A badge rested beside an unfinished bowl of stew. No one went in. The market closed a week later. Not officially, no one announced it. People just stopped showing up. The hunters returned with empty hands. The fish swam deeper. Even the birds quieted. There was no meat, no eggs, no rabbits snared in the brush. It was as if the animals knew what had happened and wanted no part in it. And so the hunger crept back in. Only now, it came with guilt. The children cried at night, though no one told them the full story. But they knew. Children always know. Their parents stopped singing. The candles burned low and long, and the windows were never opened. And then the ground began to change. It started behind the smokehouse ruins, where the bones had first surfaced, where the chest of tokens had been unearthed. The earth there wouldn't settle. Not properly. It sank in places, shallow dips, like graves dug too hastily. One morning, a woman walking her dog stepped into one of the soft patches. Her leg disappeared to the thigh. When she was pulled out, her boot was missing, and in its place, a tiny arm bone. She didn't scream. She simply walked home and locked her door. Another man reported hearing voices near the ruins. Whispers, not words, just the sound of something spoken through ash. And always the same thing afterward. A humming, faint, familiar. The Tibido sisters were gone, but something of them remained. The town held no meeting, no votes, no prayers. They simply agreed, without speaking, to stay away from that land. The field was roped off, staked with warning signs. No one dared write. No one tilled it. No one walked their animals through it. No one spoke its name aloud. It became a scar they built themselves around. But scars itch, and secrets grow, especially when buried in hunger. One night, 2 young men cousins, half drunk and full of bravado, decided to test the legend. Said they didn't believe in ghosts, that the priest had lit the fire out of guilt, not justice, that the sisters were clever murderers, sure, but nothing more. Dead's dead. One of them said. They went with lanterns and spades. Said they'd dig up the rest of the bones and sell them to a traveling doctor. Let the sisters be useful one last time. They joked. They never came home. At dawn, their mothers found the lanterns lying cold in the mud, just beyond the rope. The boys weren't there, but something else was. A trail of white buttons, tiny chipped. And 2 shallow trenches dug halfway, and then stopped as if the earth itself had swallowed their shovels. The town said nothing. They simply tied new ropes, raised the stakes higher. The pastor who replaced Father Enri was a city man, young, pale, a good speaker. He arrived in boots too clean and eyes too eager. He lasted 6 sermons. The last one was delivered to an empty chapel, save for one woman in the back pew who wept the entire time. When he left, he didn't pack. He simply walked into the trees and never returned. His suitcase was found 2 days later behind the ruins. Inside, a single letter unopened on the envelope, scrawled in a hurried hand. They're not gone. The fog grew thicker in the weeks that followed. And with it, the dreams returned. Some had never left, but now they spread feverish and vivid. People dreamt of knives, of hooks, of dark rooms warmed by firelight and humming. They dreamt of stew, of bones cracking gently under teeth. They woke with their mouths watering and their stomachs sick. One woman, widowed and once grateful for the sisters' charity, was found trying to cook her cat. She didn't seem to know what she was doing. When the neighbors stopped her, she only whispered, "The meat is running out." No one pressed charges, no one brought it up again. Instead, the townsfolk began to whisper another story, not about the past, about the present, about how the Tibido sisters might still be near, not as flesh and blood, but as something older, more rooted. Something that couldn't burn, that didn't bleed, that fed not on bodies anymore, but on memory. And that memory was in all of them because they had eaten it, they had loved it, and in loving it, they had let it into their tables, into their prayers, into their children. The town didn't need the sisters anymore. It had become them. Every porch that welcomed silence over questions, every kitchen that cooked without knowing, every mouth that had ever whispered, "Don't ask." It was never just a smokehouse that fed Cypress Hollow. It was Cypress Hollow that fed the smokehouse. And now there was no smoke, but the hunger still remained. There was something strange about the hunger in Cypress Hollow now. It wasn't just the stomach kinda ache that growls when you've missed supper. No, this was deeper, rooted behind the ribs, laced into the marrow. It didn't care if your belly was full or your cupboards were bare. It whispered, it tugged, it remembered, and worse so did the people. Though the market remained shuttered and the stew pots empty, some folks still found themselves standing at the stove long after midnight, breathing in phantom smells, smoke, garlic, sweetness, something just on the edge of copper. They'd stir nothing in empty pots, watch water boil for hours. Sometimes they'd reach into the pantry and forget what they came for. The Tibido sisters were gone, but the town still heard their recipe, and it spoke in cravings. One woman, once a baker, awoke to find her hands raw and bloody, the dough streaked with something red. Her husband had been gone a week, supposedly visiting cousins upstate. No one asked her what she was baking. She burned it before anyone saw. She left town 2 days later, taking nothing but a wooden spoon and a suitcase full of prayer cards. Another choir kind. Once the schoolteacher stopped speaking entirely. He simply stood at his window each evening, staring toward the ruins. His garden withered. His door remained unlocked. When asked why, he finally answered, "They're not coming for me. I already ate." And then there was the Hollow's last child, a baby boy born pale and near lifeless, who cried for 7 straight nights and never opened his eyes. The midwife claimed it was a fever. Others whispered the truth aloud only once. He was born. Remembering, after that, no children were born in Cypress Hollow. Not a single one. The people stopped trying. The hunger had shifted. It wasn't about meat anymore. It was about what had been lost. Because behind that hunger was something far crueler than want. It was mourning. But not for the dead. For the taste. They'd loved it. They had praised it. They had begged for seconds. And now that it was gone, the world seemed grayer. Food seemed dull. Life itself, flat and flickering like a lantern running low. Gratitude, once warm and honest, had curdled into grief. No one admitted it aloud, but they all felt it. Even those who had never tasted Tibido stew directly, the children, the newcomers, felt the emptiness. It was in the soil, in the silence between thunder and rain, in the creak of wood that sounded too much like a voice. In the night, no one could escape it, because Cypress Hollow had eaten too well for too long, and no one leaves a feast like that unchanged. They tried. God, they tried. New pastors came. Young men with strong hands and soft sermons. Each brought a smile, a cross, a new hope. And each left within weeks, either by road or by madness. One was found sitting in the chapel cellar, scribbling nonsense on the stone with a chicken bone. Another was last seen walking into the swamp barefoot, humming a lullaby no one remembered teaching him. Eventually, no one came to replace them. The chapel was left to the wasps and vines, but people still lit candles at the threshold, quietly, without songs, as if trying to barter with ghosts. Others sought to leave town altogether. Some succeeded. Most didn't. because even the road changed. What was once a muddy trail out toward the east grew stranger, bending where it shouldn't, turning travelers back to the places they'd just passed. Horses grew spooked near the ruins, wheels snapped, maps blurred, and compasses spun like spinning tops. Those who did escape rarely spoke of it, and those who stayed behind made peace with the idea that maybe they weren't supposed to leave. It wasn't punishment, it was digestion. They were inside something now, living, breathing history. Stomach walls of smoke and soil, they were the bones buried beneath the floorboards, and some had started dreaming in red again. In these dreams, they stood in the Tibido kitchen, Ullei by the window, slicing herbs, Maybel by the pot, humming. The stew would bubble, the ladle would stir, and when the dreamer looked down into their bowl, they would see something familiar, a necklace, a doll's hand, a name carved into bone. The worst part, they kept eating. Even in dreams they brought the spoon to their lips, trembling, and the stew was always perfect. Some stopped sleeping altogether, but it didn't help. The hunger only grew louder in the waking hours. There were rumors now of a new recipe, not made by the sisters, not written down, one that lived in the mouths of the townsfolk, passed from stomach to soul, a recipe not for stew but for forgetting. You had to cook it just right, 1 part denial, 2 parts silence, a generous helping of gratitude, simmered over shame. And if done right, you'd never have to admit the truth. Never say their names. Never ask where the meat came from. Just chew and smile and forget. They say some still follow the recipe to this day, that they cook something in their kitchens alone after dark, that they hum, and that sometimes, when the pot is just the right temperature and the broth glistens just so, they see her, Ullei, in the corner of the room, eyes soft, lips smiling, or Maybel, behind the stove, her ribbon blowing gently, even though there is no wind. And in that moment, some say the hunger finally ends, not because it's been fed, but because it has taken root and no longer needs to be. There was something strange about the hunger in Cypress Hollow now. It wasn't just the stomach kinda ache that growls when you've missed supper. No, this was deeper, rooted behind the ribs, laced into the marrow. It didn't care if your belly was full or your cupboards were bare. It whispered, it tugged, it remembered, and worse, so did the people, though the market remained shuttered and the stew pots empty. Some folks still found themselves standing at the stove long after midnight, breathing in phantom smells, smoke, garlic, sweetness, something just on the edge of copper. They'd stir nothing in empty pots, watch water boil for hours. Sometimes they'd reach into the pantry and forget what they came for. The Tibido sisters were gone, but the town still heard their recipe, and it spoke in cravings. One woman, once a baker, awoke to find her hands raw and bloodied, dough-streaked, with something red. Her husband had been gone a week, supposedly visiting cousins upstate. No one asked her what she was baking. She burned it before anyone saw. She left town 2 days later, taking nothing but a wooden spoon and a suitcase full of prayer cards. Another man, quiet kind. Once the school teacher stopped speaking entirely, he simply stood at his window each evening, staring toward the ruins. His garden withered, his door remained unlocked. When asked why, he finally answered, "They're not coming for me. I already ate." And then there was the Hollow's last child, a baby boy born pale and near lifeless, who cried for 7 straight nights and never opened his eyes. The midwife claimed it was a fever. Others whispered the truth aloud only once. He was born. Remembering, after that, no children were born in Cypress Hollow, not a single one. The people stopped trying. The hunger had shifted. It wasn't about meat anymore. It was about what had been lost, because behind that hunger was something far crueler than want. It was mourning, but not for the dead, for the taste. They'd loved it. They had praised it. They had begged for seconds. And now that it was gone, the world seemed grayer. Food seemed dull. Life itself, flat and flickering like a lantern running low. Gratitude, once warm and honest, had curdled into grief. No one admitted it aloud, but they all felt it. Even those who had never tasted Tibido stew directly, the children, the newcomers, felt the emptiness. It was in the soil, in the silence between thunder and rain, in the creak of wood that sounded too much like a voice. In the night no one could escape it because Cypress Hollow had eaten too well, for too long, and no one leaves a feast like that unchanged. They tried, God, they tried. New pastors came, young men with strong hands and soft sermons. Each brought a smile, a cross, a new hope, and each left within weeks, either by road or by madness. One was found sitting in the chapel cellar, scribbling nonsense on the stone with a chicken. Bone. Another was last seen walking into the swamp barefoot, humming a lullaby no one remembered teaching him. Eventually, no one came to replace them. The chapel was left to the wasps and vines, but people still lit candles at the threshold, quietly, without songs, as if trying to barter with ghosts. Others sought to leave town altogether. Some succeeded. Most didn't, because even the road changed. What was once a muddy trail out toward the east grew stranger, bending where it shouldn't, turning travelers back to the places they'd just passed. Horses grew spooked near the ruins, wheels snapped, maps blurred, and compasses spun like spinning tops. Those who did escape rarely spoke of it, and those who stayed behind made peace with the idea that maybe they weren't supposed to leave. It wasn't punishment, it was digestion. They were inside something now, living, breathing history, stomach walls of smoke and soil. They were the bones buried beneath the floorboards, and some had started dreaming in red again. In these dreams, they stood in the Tibido kitchen, Ullei by the window, slicing herbs, Maybel by the pot, humming. The stew would bubble, the ladle would stir, and when the dreamer looked down into their bowl, they would see something familiar, a necklace, a doll's hand, a name carved into bone. The worst part, they kept eating. Even in dreams, they brought the spoon to their lips, trembling, and the stew was always perfect. Some stopped sleeping altogether, but it didn't help. The hunger only grew louder in the waking hours. There were rumors now of a new recipe, not made by the sisters, not written down, one that lived in the mouths of the townsfolk, passed from stomach to soul. A recipe not for stew, but for forgetting. You had to cook it just right, 1 part denial, 2 parts silence, a generous helping of gratitude, simmered over shame. And if done right, you'd never have to admit the truth, never say their names. Never ask where the meat came from, just chew and smile and forget. They say some still follow the recipe to this day, that they cook something in their kitchens alone after dark, that they hum, and that sometimes, when the pot is just the right temperature, and the broth glistens just so, they see her. Ullei in the corner of the room, eyes soft, lips smiling, or Maybel behind the stove, her ribbon blowing gently, even though there is no wind. And in that moment, some say, the hunger finally ends, not because it's been fed, but because it has taken root and no longer needs to be. By the end of that year, Cypress Hollow was no longer a town. Not really. It still had houses, still had fences half swallowed by moss, still had a post office, its windows fogged and useless. But the people no longer called it home. They called it what it was, a hollow, not just a place, but a feeling, a shape made by something that had been there too long and then vanished, leaving only the curve of its absence, and the people inside. They didn't speak much anymore, not to each other, not to God, not even to themselves, because words they had learned were dangerous. Words led to names, names led to memory, and memory, real, raw, unfiltered memory, was unbearable, so they let silence grow like ivy. The walls thickened with it, the chimneys breathed it, the beds creaked with it in the middle of the night when dreams returned with wet breath and kitchen smoke. But there was one house that still stood untouched, the Tibido cottage. It should have burned. No one understood why it hadn't. It sat there, clean and pale, at the edge of the woods where the path curved in a way that made no sense. Its lace curtains still danced in the breeze. Its porch remained swept. The ivy never climbed its walls. Not even the crows perched on its roof. No one went near it, not because they feared what was inside, but because they feared what wasn. Single quotes. No firewood stacked, no laundry hung, no sound, just stillness, that awful waiting stillness. And the door always looked unlocked, as if it were daring someone to open it, daring someone to ask what was left behind. One boy did. 16, reckless, the kind who climbs roofs and skips church and doesn't believe in anything older than himself, he said. He wanted to prove it wasn't cursed, just an old house. He laughed. They're all gone, burned. The priest ran off. Nothing left but cowards and old stories. He walked the trail alone, carrying a lantern and a slingshot. He never came back, but the next morning the house had changed. The curtain in the left bedroom window had been pulled slightly aside, and on the porch, where dust had never gathered before, were footprints. Bare, small, as if a girl had walked out into the moonlight, just to listen. They found the boy's slingshot days later, set neatly on the chapel steps, wrapped in linen, a thank you maybe, or a reminder. After that, the townspeople did not walk that trail. Even the trees near the Tibido path began to grow wrong, their trunks twisted, their bark peeled like old wallpaper, revealing a pale wood beneath that seemed to sweat. Sometimes at night the trees creaked, not with wind but with rhythm, a rocking, a lullaby. And that's when the voices returned, not the sisters themselves. Not quite, but something in their shape, a whisper in the pantry, a breath behind a door, a giggle beneath the floorboards when the stew boils too long. One man claimed to have seen them, said they stood at the edge of his cornfield, just beyond the scarecrow. One tall, one small, both holding baskets, neither moved, neither blinked. He shut his eyes, counted to 3. When he opened them, they were gone. But in the basket near his porch, he found something, wrapped in oil cloth, still warm. He never said what was inside, but after that night, he refused to eat, ever again. The townsfolk began aging strangely, some too fast, wrinkles carving through cheeks like knives, others too slow, faces too smooth, eyes too bright, as if they'd been preserved in salt. One woman was found sitting in a chair on her porch, unmoving. Her hair had gone white overnight. She was smiling, mouth full of something. When they opened it, her tongue was gone, just a spoon left resting inside. Then the digging started. No one knew who began it, but suddenly, yards across Cypress Hollow had small, fresh holes, just 1 or 2 feet deep, some in gardens, others beneath floorboards, some in the church basement, lined like graves. At first, people filled them back in, but they kept returning, and sometimes things were inside them, a tooth, a strip of ribbon, a slice of thigh bone carved with initials. They stopped covering them, they just stepped around them now. Like potholes in a road, they had all chosen to keep driving down, and the worst part, some of them began to understand that the hunger, after all, had never been about meat. It was about something deeper, older, more honest. It was about wanting to belong to something, no matter how awful. The sisters hadn't just fed the town, they had created a communion, a shared guilt, a secret pact, and now, even with their bodies gone, their recipe lived on. Inside the people. In the way they looked away instead of looking close. In the way they preferred mystery over mourning. In the way they still licked their lips when they thought no one was watching. And so, slowly, the hollow changed again, not visibly, not at first. But inside. Men who once hunted now refused to kill. Women who once gardened now planted only herbs, rosemary, thyme, bay leaf. Spices, not food. They were no longer preparing meals. They were preparing memory, because that's what the sisters had really left behind. Not bones. Not recipes, but a craving for forgetting. And Cypress Hollow was learning, little by little, how to eat itself alive without ever opening its mouth. There was no final scream. No last gasp, no church bell toll, no collective shudder through the woods. Cypress Hollow did not end in fire or flood, or holy reckoning. It ended in quiet, and it stayed that way. The chapel collapsed under its own sorrow. The roof caved in first, then the steeple cracked like a snapped tooth. The pews became mulch. But even after the collapse, candles continued appearing on its ruins, fresh wicks, still burning. No one was ever seen lighting them. The house never aged. Its shutters didn't rot, its porch didn't buckle. No weeds grew through its floorboards. Some nights, smoke curled gently from the chimney, despite no fire being lit, and if you passed too close, the curtains twitched, as if someone had just turned from the window. No one touched the door, no one needed to, because the house wasn't a place anymore, it was a choice, and Cypress Hollow had already made it. It chose to forget what truth felt like. It chose the warmth of stew over the sting of honesty. It chose silence over and over, and in doing so it became something new, not a town, not even a hollow, something deeper, older, a mouth, the kind of mouth that doesn't speak but remembers taste, the kind that doesn't chew but hungers. And every person who remained inside it, every woman, every man, every child born after carried a piece of that mouth with them. Not just in their bellies, but in the things they chose not to say. That's how the hunger lived on. It wasn't ghosts that haunted the hollow, it was complicity, and complicity, once fed, becomes culture. Visitors on the rarest occasions, they made it through the twisted road, said the people of Cypress Hollow looked normal, maybe a little pale, maybe a bit too quiet, but polite. Smiling. Helpful. They offered tea, they offered biscuits, they offered stew, and most visitors accepted. Because hospitality is hard to question, and questioning a gift, well, that's not neighborly, is it? No one ever asked what was in the broth. Not really. And that, as always, was enough, just like it had been in the beginning, just like it always would be, because the Tibido sisters had never needed to force anyone, they only needed to offer. And once you accept a kindness, without asking its cost. You are part of the hollow, you are part of the table, you are part of the recipe. Some say the sisters are still in that house, but not as bodies. Not even as spirits, as rules. As rhythm. As the soft tap of a knife on cutting board, echoing through the trees. As the scent that drifts through a fog too thick for weather. Some say that if you stand where the chapel once stood, you'll hear it. The scrape of a ladle in a cast iron pot, a hum that doesn't belong to any voice you know. And if you listen long enough, you'll find yourself nodding along because it's always been familiar. The hunger was never something Cypress Hollow had. It was something it became, and it never left. It simply fed itself, and it learned you don't need to chase people down. To feed the hollow, you just need to wait, because sooner or later, someone's going to get hungry, and when they do, they'll come down the trail. Past the crows, past the trees that whisper, past the bones still warm beneath the dirt. They'll reach the porch, and they'll knock. Once, twice. Then they'll put their hand on the doorknob and ask the oldest question there is, can I come in? And the answer always is waiting, not in words, but in scent, in warmth, in something bubbling on the stove, because the hollow doesn't speak anymore. It doesn't need to. It has us.